Islam literally means surrender to the will of God. And Muhammad, of course, born in 570, got these ideas in this cave. He was listening to some kind of spirit, and he claimed that there was a voice of God. And this voice told him that there were many supernatural beings in the world, and these supernatural beings would basically halfway between men and angels, and so he called them jinns, and these were half men and half angels, kind of halfway between men and angels. Maybe that's a better way of saying it. But Muhammad believed that that Satan was an evil jinn, and that there were many prophets that were God had sent into the world, and but there was one true prophet, and of this God Allah, and so a couple things that they had to do, basically 5 keys that Muslims had to do and to practice their faith. Number 1 was to recite the Muslim creed. And the Muslim creed said, I believe there is no God but Allah, and that Muhammad is his prophet. So they had to recite that. And number 2, that they would pray 5 times a day. And face east as they prayed, bowing toward Mecca. So you'll see pictures of Muslims in mosques, and they're always facing a certain direction. That's toward Mecca. When they pray, they put these little prayer rugs down, and they kneel down on them so they don't get dirty while they're praying. They're also, number 3, required to fast. And they fast 1 month out of each year. Now, that doesn't mean they eat nothing during that month, but it's only certain hours of the day, from sunrise to sunset. No man or beast is allowed to eat or drink anything. This 1 month is called Ramadan, and it's a month of fasting. Okay. Number 4, all Muslims are required to give alms to the poor. So, to help relieve the poor situation, they have to give alms. And number 5, they're required to make at least 1 trip to Mecca, which is their holy city, at least once in their lifetime. So once during, and this would be known as a pilgrimage. You visit a holy site, and that would be Mecca. And so there's a lot of various regulations and rules that the Muslims follow, and you can see that these include these 5 keys that they must follow. Let's talk about Hegira. Now, Hegira is when Muhammad was forced to flee, and he took flight, and in Mecca there were a lot of persecutions, So he went away, and he left and went to Medina. Okay, so this took place in 622 A.D. You can see he was 52 years old. Okay, and this is the start date for Muslims starting with their faith. And so he left in secrecy, and this is his flight, Hijra. So Hijra is the flight of Muhammad out of Mecca. Okay, so he went to Medina, and he soon became ruler of that city. Okay, and then they raided caravans. His followers raided caravans from Mecca and grew wealthy. So Muhammad's death came in 630 A.D. He died, and then 632. Gave you the wrong date there. Pardon me. 632. And basically attempted to clear all the idols from these areas his followers held. And by the time he died in 632, most of the Arab tribes in what's today known as Arabia followed Muhammad and followed this new faith. Okay. Now, when he died, there was a problem who would take over, and there was a power struggle. And the man who succeeded him, and his name was Abu Bakr. And he became the first Caliph. And the first Caliph, of course, this was given to a Muslim ruler. So some of you may remember ISIS, the Muslim state, the violent state in Syria that had been established about 3 years ago. And President Trump and the U.S. military went in, and they, because ISIS was killing so many people, these Muslims, which we would call radical Muslims, they were setting up a caliphate. So ISIS was actually a caliphate, and they were trying to reestablish a rule over this kingdom, caliphate. So this is happening today, and there was a very holy place called the Kaaba, and this is in Mecca. And the Kaaba is like a holy temple, and it houses a black stone that Muslims consider is sacred. Okay, they believe that it was sent from heaven, and this is the spot where people, and a good picture of it's on page 239 of your textbook, but this is where people face the Kaaba. So it's a black stone that's in Mecca, and they face that when they pray. Now, one of the amazing things, I think amazing, is the growth of Islam, because to me it's an oppressive, man-made religion, and I would never follow it. It just makes no sense. It's violent. There's murdering lots of people, killing people who don't convert. There's the idea of jihad, which is a holy war, and if you die while you're waging this holy war against people who are non-Islamic, you immediately go to heaven, and you have 70 virgin women that are yours to have in heaven. That's what the Muslims teach. So to me, this is crazy, worldly, non-rational. It doesn't make any sense to me at all, except it appeals to people who, are really, caught in bondage. And so I'm all for missions, and would, before preaching the Bible, preaching the gospel to Muslims. But I'm always amazed at how fast Islamic, the religion spread. And I think it spread very fast because by 640, all of Syria, and so this is just a few years after Muhammad dies, the followers have spread it all over Syria and Canaan. Okay, now that doesn't mean that everyone supported Islamic ideas. In fact, this was spread militarily. These guys came in and they would say, "Hey, you've got to follow us or you're dead." And then if we kill you in this holy war, we're really saving you, and you will then be able to go to heaven as a Muslim. And if we die in this holy war, this jihad, then we know we'll be in heaven, and with 70 virgins in heaven. So this is, just, it spread very harshly, and I think that's what, it is so harsh, it is so deadly that people just give up and succumb to it. They live under Islam because they simply don't have much choice. Now, if you look on page 241, you'll notice the growth, and notice it's this vast area, but most of that vast area is desert, number one. Number two, most of the people in that area are not Muslim. They didn't convert. They didn't become Muslims, but they're under a Islamic caliphate. Okay? And these caliphs rule because of being so harsh. So that's my understanding of why these caliphates grew so quickly. Okay? Now, Muslims have a number of things that are very admirable in the culture that they bring. For instance, the architecture is very beautiful. If you think of the Alhambra in Spain, is one of the most beautiful palaces ever made. So I think it's amazing. It's beautiful work. So there are some very beautiful qualities about the culture. One of the things that is also very admirable is their schooling. There's a lot of good schooling, particularly in the area of mathematics. Okay. We think of the Arabic numerals. Okay. Arabic numbers. There's the Roman numerals, and then there's the Arabic numerals. Something that we think of often is the mosques that are their places of worship, and these big towers called minarets. It's from these towers that's announced 5 times a day prayer. So they send off a person who calls the people to prayer. So there's a prayer call from the minaret. So you want to make sure that you understand those terms. Okay? And so you can see how with Muslim advance and with the attack of these tribes, these violent tribes, you can see Europe really felt itself under siege. Europe was under siege. And so we have the growth of feudalism. People banding together under a noble, giving their covenant obedience to a noble in turn for protection, basically. Now, I've given you a sheet that you should have downloaded. It's from Chepstow Castle. And if you grab that, this is the plan of a medieval castle. This is in England. And this is a real place. This whole castle is still there. And you can see the whole idea is a fortified, it's just like one fortification added to another, to another, to another. And the oldest part goes all the way back to 1067. Now that's 1 year after William the Conqueror invades and conquers England. And so there's the great tower that you can see right in the middle. It's a big fortified, big boxy fort, big thick walls. And that's really what these were when they came to England. When the Normans bring the feudalism to England, they bring the castles, they bring the tournaments, they bring feudalism, they bring their French language. They really dominate England for a good long time. Now, a bailey is a fortified area. So there's a bailey is just this big area with a wall. And you can see their lower bailey, the middle bailey, and the upper bailey. And a barbican is an area, again, it's fortified. It's like an extension out from the building, from the main castle. And you can see they had a river on one side. And, they tried to have moats built and to protect the fortification. And then they had these towers, these great towers that rose, and it was all the idea of a fort. So in England, it was a fort telling all the English that the Normans were in control, and this is where they were, and if you submitted, then we are okay, but if you don't submit, you're going to be warring against the Normans. And they have the forces and the castles and the oppression. So castle was a very hated thing in England. But generally speaking, the castle was a fort to protect the noble or the liege, lord. And then the peasants would serve as the army, and they would also benefit from the castle if needed. So they could be brought in, and food and all kinds of materials would be a blessing. So on page 245 in your textbook, you can see a tower. This is a medieval donjon, which is French for dungeon. It is a fortified tower. We think of dungeons sometimes as being way down in the ground where you put criminals and you put prisoners. But the dungeon really is a fortified tower, and it was a protection against attack. Now, you see down below the dungeon, there's a wall, and so that would be the bailey. Okay, so the bailey would be that region that would be surrounding and giving protection to the castle. Now, a second sheet that I got for you, that I made, has some tapestries. And these are 3 medieval tapestries. And the top one, you can see there's a siege going on. and there's people attacking a castle. And so up in the top right, there's a guy leaning out of a big tower shooting arrows down. But there's also these attackers are attacking the castle, and there's a guy on the far left who has a trebuchet, and it's like a giant sling, and he's pulling it down to load the trebuchet, and then they're going to release it and try to knock down the castle tower. So you can see there's people being trampled to death underneath. There's guys in mail, which is the chain mail. It's like little fine links that protect a person from arrows. So you put on a chain mail suit, and you put armor over the top of it, and you put your helmet on above that. So that top one is a Crusader Siege, and they're besieging the areas there in the Holy Land that are held by the Muslims. Then that middle one, lower left maybe, is a picture showing how they would be using falcons. And the falcons they would send up and grab a bird, attack a bird, and bring the bird back. So this way of hunting. Falconry was hunting, or sometimes known as hawking, was hunting, and used by wealthy people. You can see the covered glove that they had, big thick leather gloves, so that the falcon would not pierce through into the skin. And then the lower diagram is the Red Knight, this famous tapestry, really describes some of the accoutrements, the coverings, and the armor that the horse and the knight would have. So this is like three pictures of life in medieval England. Now I'm going to take a look at this passage that I got for you. It's a passage out of a book of mine, which is The Castle at War, and it's a good one. I think you'll enjoy reading this entire selection. But if you look on page 186, the very first page, so on this page, let's look at the middle paragraph, actually page 187. And this is the Castle at War. You don't need to take notes on this, but I will write down any terms that you need to look up or to understand. Just follow along with this. You don't need to read further than I do in this article, unless you'd like to. It's a good article, good chapter out of this book. I thought you'd enjoy it, but it's not for you to, there's not an assignment from it, and it's more for your understanding. So you may want to read it in its entirety later. Let's look on page 187. Nevertheless, when war broke out, it inevitably revolved around castles. Enemy castles were major political military objectives in themselves, and many were cited specifically to bar invasion routes. Typically, the castle stood on high ground, commanding a river crossing, a river confluence, a stretch of navigation, a coastal harbor, a mountain pass, or some other strategically important feature. The castle inside a city could be defended long after the city had been taken, and an unsubdued castle garrison could sally out and reoccupy the town the moment the enemy left. Even a rural castle could not safely be bypassed because its garrison would cut the invaders' supply lines. The mobility of the garrison, nearly always supplied with horses, conferred a large strategic radius for many purposes: raiding across a border, furnishing a supply base for an army on the offensive, interrupting road or river traffic at a distance. For all these reasons, medieval military science was the science of the attack and defense of the castles. The castle's main line of resistance was the curtain wall. Could you underline curtain wall? With its projecting towers. The ground in front of the curtain was kept free of all cover. If there was a moat, the ground was cleared well beyond it. Where the approach to the castle was limited by the site, and especially where it was limited to one single direction, the defenses on the vulnerable side multiplied, with combinations of walls, moats, and towers masking the main curtain wall. At Chepstow, now that's the one that we saw the diagram, the eastern end was protected by the great gatehouse with its arrow loops, portcullises, and machicolations. The Barbican, built by the marshals to protect the western end, consisted of a walled enclosure 100 feet wide by 50 deep, with a powerful cylindrical tower at the southwest corner and a fortified gatehouse on the northwest. The Barbican was separated from the west curtain wall by a broad ditch, or dry moat, crossed by a bridge with a drawspan, and overlooked by a strong rectangular tower on the inner side. The ditch ended at the south wall in an inconspicuous postern, which, even if forced, would admit the enemy only to a trap, insulated by the towers and the wall parapet. The long sides of the castle had strong natural defenses, the river with its high bluff on the north and the steep slope of the ridge on the south toward the town. Such a castle as Chepstow was practically proof against direct assault, while its size provided ample faculties for storing provisions. Some castles kept a year's supply of food or even more on hand, and the relatively small size of a 13th century garrison often meant that in a prolonged siege, the assailants, rather than the besieged, were confronted with a supply problem. A garrison of 60 men could hold out against an attacking force 10 times its number, and feeding 60 men from a well-stocked granary, supplemented by cattle, pigs, and chickens brought in at the enemy's approach, might be far easier than feeding 600 men from a war-ravaged countryside. By the late 13th century, castle logistics were on a sophisticated basis, with supplies often purchased from general contractors. Let's flip over to the next page, 189. The castle's water supply frequently offered a more vulnerable target than its food supply. Although a reliable well in or near the keep was one of the basic necessities of a castle, wells sometimes failed, and when they did, the results were disastrous. In the First Crusade, when the Turks besieged the Crusaders in the castle of Zeragordo near Nicaea and cut off their water supply, the beleaguered Christians suffered terrific hardships, drinking their horses' blood and each other's urine, and burying themselves in damp earth in hope of absorbing the moisture. After 8 days without water, the Christians surrendered and were killed or sold as slaves. 2 decades later, Count Fulk of Anjou, besieging Henry I's castle of Alencon, managed to locate and destroy an underground conduit from the river Sarthe, and the garrison was forced to surrender. In 1136, when King Stephen was besieging a rebellious baron, Baldwin of Redevers, in the castle of Exeter, the castle's 2 wells suddenly went dry. The garrison drank wine as long as it lasted, also using it to make bread, to cook, to put out fires set by the attackers. In the end, the rebels yielded, and in the words of the chronicler of the Gesta Stephani, when they finally came forth, you could have seen the body of each individual wasted and enfeebled with parching thirst, and once they were outside, they hurried rather to drink a draught of any sort than to discharge any business whatsoever. So, thirsty guys. One thing that I think is really interesting is on page 190, it talks about a frequent structural weakness of castles. Now, this is kind of interesting for the attacker, if you're trying to attack a castle, lay in their subsoil. Unless a castle was founded wholly on solid rock, some part of its walls would be undermined by digging. The procedure was to drive a tunnel beneath the wall, preferably under a corner or tower, supporting the tunnel roof with heavy timbers as the sappers advanced. When they reached a point directly under the wall, the timbering was set ablaze, collapsing the earth and the masonry above. In other words, you collapse the castle by digging a tunnel underneath and then letting it collapse. The wall of the castle will collapse. So the process was not as easy as it sounds. In 1215, when King John laid siege to Rochester Castle, a vast 12th century square keep defended by about 100 rebel knights and a number of foot soldiers and bowmen, he ordered nearby Canterbury to manufacture by day and night as many picks as you were able. 6 weeks later, the digging had progressed to the point when John commanded Justiciar Hubert de Burgh to send us with all speed by day and night 40 of the fattest pigs of the sort least good for eating to bring fire beneath the tower. The lard produced by a sufficient blaze in the mine to destroy the timbering and bring down the lard produced a sufficient blaze in the mine to destroy the timbering and bring down a great section of the wall of the keep. Wow. So he had pigs run in on fire, and they died, and they had so much oil that the lard from their fat caused the fire to increase in this tunnel, and burned up the wooden supports, and that brought down the castle wall. Wow, that was Prince John. Now on page 192, you see a couple things they used in going against the castle. One is the battering ram. You can see how they use that. Another is a trebuchet. A trebuchet is like a sling that slings rocks. And anyway, it's a violent time because people were fearful, and it was a dangerous time in Europe. Okay. Now, one of the things that's beautiful that happened as a result of this time period is the construction of the cathedral. And so we're just going to take about 5 minutes and start talking about cathedrals. I'd like you to grab the sheet that has some photos. It's two-sided, and it has Notre Dame or Chartres Cathedral on the bottom, and on the top a plan of a monastery. So here's one of the monasteries, and you can kind of see that during the Middle Ages a monastery really was a home to all these monks, and there was a lot of things going on in a monastery. They produced food, they kept animals, they also were centers of learning where they copied books. And so a monastery was like a little city in and of itself. And the church owned the land. The Catholic Church owned all the land and the buildings. And of course, none of the monks were paid, but they received food and lodging. And so it was an interesting place. On that same page, you see this rose window, this huge window at Chartres Cathedral. It's 373, and you can see the cathedrals were being built as we move from the feudalism period to where now there's towns and being built. Now, on the bottom of the page, lower right, you're on the floor of the cathedral looking up, and you can see the vaulting. And this is the vault that's right above where the choir would sit, and you can see that it's like a fan. These are called fan vaults. The structure rises up on both sides of the wall, and when it reaches to the ceiling, it kind of spreads out, and you can see the This is all made out of stone, amazingly. But you can see what the goal here is to take the weight of the roof and transfer it to the walls. And so that's how they did it. They had these curved vaults that met at the very top of the roof, and they transfer the weight of the roof to the walls. So we'll talk more about that next week. Let's flip the page, and so that you can start to learn some of the structures of a cathedral, I'd like you to look at figure 52, which is on that page, 52, perspective section of a nave bay of Amiens Cathedral. A is the nave, that's where the people sit, so that'd be the nave arcade. B, the Triforium, you can see where the Triforium is up just above that, and these arches had these little columns, and they call them Triforium because there's 3 little open sections in the arch. So if you'd underlined B, Triforium, you need to know that term. So underline B, Triforium. Then we reach C, the Clerestory, or Clerestory, as some people would say it. And C is this area that is really over to the left. Actually, it's no, it's not. It's above the Triforium. So C is referring to that whole window area that you can see there. It's really to the left of that big C. And so that capital C, Clerestory, lets light in. So that's an important thing in a cathedral where you're trying to let light in above, because you're trying to kind of have filtered light that comes down. The idea is to people coming into a cathedral, their vision is directed immediately upwards, because the ceiling, the vaults, everything direct your attention upward. And then you've got this light that's filtering in up there through these high windows, the Clerestory. And it's beautiful. The goal was to make a person feel like they're entering a holy, heavenly realm. They're entering into God's presence. They're thinking of heaven. It lifts your eyes off of the earth into this upper realm of heaven. It was kind of making you heavenly minded as you walked into a cathedral. That was their goal. Now they had side aisles, and then E, a buttress. So if you look at this big buttress, which is letter E, it's this big buttress on the left side of this cutaway. The whole mason structure there, this big heavy tower, is the buttress. Okay, now so this is the buttress which is outside of the building, and the buttress is holding up the walls of the building. Because remember, the weight of the roof is being transferred to the walls, and you need something to keep the walls from just caving and collapsing to the outside. So you put this buttress out there. So the buttress, if you'd underline E, buttress, and then F is a pinnacle, which is just sort of a decorative thing on top of the buttress. You don't need to underline that. But if you get down to letter B, compound pier. Now, compound pier is this big support, like column, and they call those piers. So letter B, compound pier. Then you have a respond, which is letter C, and a mullion, which is D. Now, mullion is just a center support of a big glass window. So you see the little D. I'd like you to know what a mullion is. Okay. Now let's flip over to F, a transverse rib. So F are these ribs near the ceiling that reach up to the very top of the ceiling. That's a transverse rib, and then G is a diagonal rib. And you can just see these are ribs, which are vaults, and they're allowing the weight to be shifted from the ceiling on out to the walls. And then there's J, a strut. So if you would underline that, that's part of the outside transfer of weight to the buttress. There's a J. And then K is a finial. Now, a finial is at the very top of the pinnacle. And it's just kind of like an ending point. So you don't need to know finial. But here, let me just go over again so that you can learn in identifying these things. What you should know. B, Triforium. C, Clerestory. E, buttress. B, little b, compound pier. D, mullion. F, transverse rib. G, diagonal rib. And J, strut. Okay. Now, looking over at the right side of the page, there's the inside of Notre Dame. Now, that was the cathedral that burned last year. So that's a mess today. And I think they're going to try to restore it. I think they sure should, but it's a beautiful medieval cathedral, probably best known for this big, big rose window, which is a huge, round stained glass window that was in the end of the building. And then you can see the plan of Notre Dame. You can see the how big the plan was. Now let's go to this other sheet that's just my sketch, and I'm going to ask you to write in the different features of the cathedral. So the cathedral, you're looking down on it, and it's in a cross shape, okay? And they did that on purpose. They wanted the cathedral to represent the cross of Christ. So number one is called the apse, A-P-S-E, the apse. And the apse is this area that's on one end of the cathedral. It's a rounded area. It's near where the altar, and this is the area only the priests could enter. Number two is the altar, and here's where the priests would perform the Mass, and they would stand there and they would hold up the body and blood of Christ, and it would, according to Catholic doctrine, it actually turned into the real blood and the body of Jesus, and then there was Holy Communion, okay? And then number three is a screen. So put S-C-R-E-E-N. Usually this screen was made out of wrought iron, and it kind of screened off. Only the priests could go through to the altar area to perform the sacred duties there. Now number four is the choir area, C-H-O-I-R. Number five is this projection off to the side. There's actually two on both sides of the main building. This is called the transept. So the transept is the cross, the horizontal cross area that it's pointing. But there's another one over there on the other side. And then, of course, 6 is the nave, N-A-V-E, for that diagram as well. So the nave is where the people, the congregation, sit. Okay, let's drop down to the lower part of the page. I'm going to give you the definition. Just put this on pause so that you can write it down. The clerestory is the upper wall of the church that is composed of windows, letting light in. The upper wall of the church. Vault is a stone support extending from a pier to the top of the ceiling. transferring the weight of the ceiling to the walls. Buttress is a heavy stone masonry wall outside of the church that holds up the walls of the church by means of the flying buttress or the strut. Flying buttress is a type of strut that transfers the weight of the wall outward to a pier or buttress outside the church. Rose window is a round colored window used in Gothic churches and cathedrals. Cruciform means that the shape of the building is cross-shaped as you look at it from above, with the nave and the choir being the vertical part of the cross, and the transept is the horizontal part of the cross. So cruciform really means cross-shaped church. And with that, I think we will stop today because we need to, and we need to let you guys do your other work. So we will see you next week. God bless you. And I hope that you do well on your research paper and that goes well for you this week. Bye.